I'm a librarian here at the Central Library, and I have the pleasure of working with the League of Women Voters, and am particularly glad to see all of you here for today's topic, fake news, which is something that we at the library deal with quite often, and digital literacy and media literacy are close to our hearts in being able to engage with everyone and bring everyone's skills and literacy levels up on that. So we are quite excited about today's panel. Couple of announcements before we bring up the league. We do have an event coming up this Monday, the 23rd at 4 p.m. We will be having a panel with Santa Barbara organizations that work internationally, and this will also be a conversation with Nicholas Kristof. Registration is required for that one, as we are expecting a full room for that. So you can go to our website. It's just sbplibrary.org. Go to our events calendar, click on the 23rd, navigate to the Kristof event with arts and lectures, and make sure you register, as that we are expecting it to fill up. So if you would like to be at that conversation with Kristof and the international orgs that are based here in Santa Barbara, please do that. There is, my next thing, there is a calendar in the back that is on the resources table with a number of the other fake news flyers, so you can pick up that April calendar of events for the library. There is also specific quarter flyers for that event, as well as some of our upcoming Earth Day celebration events. So being waved around in the back there, you can pick up the calendar on your way out, but wanted to let you know about that as it is going to fill up. With that, I would like to introduce Lindsay Baker, the co-presiding officer for the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara, to bring us into the afternoon.
Welcome. I'd like to thank the Santa Barbara Public Library for co-sponsoring this forum with our league, also Gary Atkins Sound System, and representing Translinguistic Services today is Olivia Uribe. She is at the front table next to the sound system, and if you want to hear this program simultaneously in Spanish, you can sit up there next to her and hear it. It will be on TVSB in Spanish and English later after this program. This forum, as I mentioned, is being recorded by TVSB and will be available on Channel 17. You may check on their website on Under Demand and then Video. Then you can look at the schedule and see when the program will be broadcast. If you are interested in learning more about the League, you can speak to Bev at the table by the entrance. She'd be happy to speak to you about the League. The library was generous today to produce a flyer for your information regarding evaluating fake news, and there's copies on 2 tables at the entrance, so you can pick one of those up. I'd like to thank Susan Horn and Jane Benefield for organizing this forum. At your seats are index cards for questions, which we will pick up at the break. And also there's a little piece of paper that the library has so that you would indicate how you heard about this forum. If you look up at the speaker table, you'll see an empty spot. Don't worry, that person is coming. She teaches a class at UCSB, and we have her last on the program today because she has to teach her class and then she'll be here. So you will have a full panel today. I would like to remind everyone that the League of Women Voters does not support candidates or parties. So when you're asking questions or speaking, please refrain from partisan questions or comments. Thank you for your cooperation with that. I have a few announcements for the League. We will be holding candidate forums. We will be in Harding School for District 3 for a City Council seat on May 1st. On May 4th, we will be at TVSB doing a county sheriff forum. You can watch that on TVSB. The League of Women Voters will be holding its annual meeting on May 19th. The annual meeting packet is going out the end of this week, and you should have it at least by the first of next week. Please note that there will be additional information to the packet online, and it will be the league bylaws. So pay attention to that information, please. This coming month of May, we're changing around some of our units so that we can accomplish some different goals. The Carpinteria unit will be on May 1st, and they will be going to the high school and registering students. And the May 1st unit at Madame Lou is moving to May 2 since we're having the candidate forum on May 1st. I hope that wasn't confusing. And the Monday unit has been canceled. Also going out this week in the mail is the League's annual fundraising letter, so please take a look out for that. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, and her name is Lisa Neubert. She is here, a resident at the Santa Barbara Public Library, and has been a programming librarian at the Santa Barbara Public Library since August 2017. She is new to Santa Barbara, having relocated from North Carolina after completing her master's library science at UNC Chapel Hill. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to pull up a PowerPoint very quickly. I'm so excited to have you at the library today. All I had to do to get here was come right up the stairs. Okay, so today we're going to take a few minutes to define fake news and take a look at its history. Then we'll examine why we're susceptible to fake news, and I think that that's the best way to help combat its effects. Finally, we'll look at a few practical ways to determine if articles you encounter online are accurate. So, the term fake news packs a lot of emotional punch, and it isn't understood by everyone the same way. It can be used derogatorily to discredit information that people don't believe, regardless of its accuracy. So, I thought today we'd start by building a common vocabulary around fake news. Broadly understood, fake news is instances of misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is simply inaccurate information. It can be intentionally or unintentionally inaccurate. It's important to note that misinformation can come from both legitimate and illegitimate news sources. Reporters are people, and sometimes they just make mistakes. They're fallible, they're subject to their own biases. But they work under a code of ethics, and they get sources, they fact check. They really want to present you with good facts. Sometimes it just doesn't happen. Illegitimate news sources, however, don't necessarily do those things. The fake news that we're going to talk about today mostly is going to be disinformation, which is intentionally deceptive information spread for a variety of reasons. And finally, it's important to note there are several of what we'll call relatives of fake news, including hoaxes, satire, algorithmic biases, and simply outdated information, and they each play their own parts in the creation and proliferation of fake news. So, to start off with, fake news isn't necessarily new. For as long as information has been distributed, so have misinformation and disinformation, for various reasons. And it's even been written about by one of history's most famous satirists, Jonathan Swift, as far back as the early 1700s. But it's even been around much longer than that. For example, in the year 500, Procopius used the power he held as a historian to destroy the legacy of Emperor Justinian after he died in one of the first recorded smear campaigns. In 1938, misinformation was spread when War of the Worlds was broadcast, and listeners tuning in mid-program missed the disclaimer that the story was fictional. And in 1999, the white supremacist group Stormfront created the website martinlutherking.org. And that was a site intended to discredit that activist. And for many years, this site was actually one of the first results when you Googled Martin Luther King Jr. on using Google. So it's important to note that this illustrates that Google isn't necessarily accurate. It's not always giving you correct information, and it's also important that one of those classic indicators that we like to take as informing us that this website is legitimate, that .org domain name, doesn't necessarily mean that you are getting accurate information. So, if fake news isn't new, why should we be worried? For me, the easy answer is that as a librarian, information access is an essential part of my professional mission. Public libraries are founded on the idea that equal access to accurate information is essential to the continuation of our democracy and the success of our nation. The more complicated answer is that information networks are changing as fast as technology is. And the way that the average person accesses news and other information is different than it was even 3 or 4 years ago. These new systems we're creating are particularly susceptible to the spread of disinformation and other forms of fake news. So, I am in fact talking about social media. What is it about social media that makes it such a hotspot for fake news? Some of the reasons include the fact that articles are often shared and liked without people even clicking on the headline. Most people won't click through to read the article or do any sort of fact-checking before sharing it with their friends. And that's partially due to the fact that there's a perceived race to be the first person to share information on Facebook or other forms of social media, to be the one to break the story, as it were, to your group of friends. And it doesn't mean that people are necessarily verifying that information before they share it. And there's also the fact that articles don't disappear when they're discredited, and they can seem perpetually new because they're not tied to something physical like a newspaper or a magazine that has its date printed on it. And when you share a link on Facebook, on your newsfeed, there's not a date linked to that. So there's no way of telling if you unless you actually click on it when that article was published. So, much like Jonathan Swift wrote about in 1710, once disinformation is out in the world, the damage is often already done. There are people who aren't going to see that it's been discredited, believe that it's untrue, or even care once they've used that information to create their opinion on the topic. And finally, social media sites are particularly susceptible to the effects of filter bubbles, which are something that we'll talk about in a few minutes. And they're likely to become echo chambers in which people are only exposed to the ideas and opinions of people that they agree with. So, we'll talk a little bit about why we're susceptible to fake news. How do we fight the spread of it on social media and otherwise? So, this comic here is an excellent example of confirmation bias, which is the idea that we instinctively look for information that confirms what we already know or believe. So, this person is doing a good thing. They go online to do their own research about a hot button issue. The problem is that they click on that very first link that they agree with. They don't go further with that. So this is also a really great example of something that librarians interact with every day, which is the concept of satisficing. So satisficing is the idea that we accept the first usable information that we encounter instead of doing more research to find something that's more pertinent or more accurate. So what you find doesn't necessarily satisfy your need, but it's good enough. One of the best ways to illustrate this is to ask yourself this question: how often do you check past the first page of Google results? Google has built their business around the knowledge that people satisfice, and their algorithm works to give you the results that you want, what you're already looking for to confirm these biases you already have, not necessarily unbiased information or even accurate information, as we talked about with martinlutherking.org. There's also information overload, and we can be inclined to accept fake news because we unconsciously filter information because we're exposed to so much of it on a daily basis. And the first thing that we filter out unconsciously is things that we don't agree with, or things that we're gonna have to think really hard about, or perhaps even change our ideas. So finally, one of the most insidious things we have to deal with when people use social media as their news source is filter bubbles. So a filter bubble is a concept presented by Eli Pariser in his 2011 TED Talk. He says that your filter bubble is the personal universe of information that you live in online. It's unique and constructed just for you by the array of personalized filters that now power the web. These algorithms decide what you see online. You don't decide what gets through your filter bubbles, and more importantly, you don't see what gets edited out. These filter bubbles are easiest to see on social media sites because part of that filtering is self-curated. You only follow people who you might agree with. You unfollow people or unfriend people who you get tired of seeing opinions that you don't agree with or the news that they're sharing, and you just delete them out of your feed. Equally as dangerous, and perhaps more insidious, are those algorithmic choices that are made for you by the website themselves, and you don't even know that they're happening. Because you're not clicking on those articles that you disagree with, Facebook just stops showing them to you. And while this might make your day-to-day internet life more pleasant, it can have disastrous consequences if you're using it as your main information source. Perhaps even more disturbing than the social media filter bubble and filtering is that most information websites have these sort of filter bubbles in place. For example, any two people in this room could Google the same search term and yield entirely different results, even when you're not logged into a Google account that has access to your personal information. Just based on where you are, what type of browser you're using, what kind of phone you have, Google is customizing your results and giving you what they think you want to see. And it's not necessarily equal information that everyone's getting, and how you're getting it is not transparent. So, all this sounds a little scary, but there are really simple steps that we can all take to help fact check information we receive every day. The most important thing is to be an active and incredulous consumer of information. So, actually click on and read the articles that you encounter. Don't assume something's true just because you read it in a headline. Know the difference between satire, propaganda, infotainment, and opinion. And finally, perhaps the hardest thing is taking that initiative to read outside your filter bubble and interact with ideas you may be uncomfortable with. That's the only way that you're going to actually see information that might come from another side that you need to see. Then, after that, you can do things like triangulate information. Are you seeing the same news in different sources? Is it coming from multiple places? If not, that's kind of a clue that you should go do a little bit more research. And an important thing is to check your biases. When you're reading something, are you reading it because you already agree with it? Are you rejecting the ideas because you already disagree with them? It's important to think about why you're agreeing or disagreeing with the news that you read. And then you can also consult expert sources. Most of the time, someone's already done the legwork to see if this information is correct or incorrect. So sites like Snopes or PolitiFacts or factcheck.org will often have already researched this for you, so you don't have to be the person to go and do all that in-depth research. Also, here at the library, we can help you with that as well. So finally, I'll leave you with a few questions that you can ask yourself when you're reading information online. If you're asking yourself even a few of these questions regularly, you'll fall into better information practices, and you'll be less susceptible to fake news if and when you encounter it. So questions like, who published the article? Is it a news source you know? Is it someone that you inherently already trust? Is there an author listed? If not, that's a good sign that you should be looking more closely at the news. What's the angle of the article? Is it perhaps sponsored content that is paid for by a company to make you think a certain way? Is the language inflammatory? Is it intentionally making you emotional? If that's true, you should also look for perhaps another source to verify the information and get a less biased opinion. A simple one is the site overrun with ads? While all news sources, or most news sources, do use ad to generate revenue, if the site has consistent pop-ups or that sort of thing, it's probably a good idea to check elsewhere for the facts. Are there supporting sources? Are they quoting other news sources? In which case, do you want to go and look at the original article that was published? Are they citing the person who actually said the things, or are they just stating things in fact and expecting you to accept them? It's also important to ask when it was published. If the news was published, more than a couple of days ago, it might be outdated already, and it's important to kind of look for current information on that same topic. And finally, are there citations? Something like Wikipedia is often disregarded as a bad information source because it's crowdfunded, but their practices of requiring citations are a really great way to know that information is true. You can go down to the bottom of that page and see exactly where they've pulled that information from, and even go to those sources yourself to fact check. And so that's all I have for you today, and I'm happy to take questions once we hit that portion. And I'm always here at the library if you have any more questions, or anyone at the library, if you have news that you think is untrue and you want to fact check it, we're here to do that. You can always come here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know personally I could listen to that over and over because there were so many good pieces of information in there. And there are some printed out, as I said, that you can help yourself to. Thank you. Next, we have Jerry Roberts. He's a veteran prize winner journalist and is the founder of Newsmakers with JR and the host of Newsmakers TV, an influential multimedia platform that reports, analyzes, and comments on politics and public policy in Santa Barbara. As a reporter and editor, he has covered politics at every level for 4 decades in print, online, and electronic media. The former manager-editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, he worked for 25 years at the paper, where he also served as political editor, city editor, and editorial page editor. In 1998, a reporting team he oversaw was runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize for a series of investigative articles on the use of safety needles, which resulted in widespread reforms throughout the U.S. healthcare industry. Jerry Roberts served as editor-in-chief of the Santa Barbara News Press from 2002 to 2006, during which time the newspaper won numerous journalism rewards. His fight for journalistic ethics in the newsroom is chronicled by the documentary Citizen Macaw. Jerry Roberts is the author of Never Let Them See You Cry, a biography of Senator Dianne Feinstein, published in 1994. Thank you for joining us.
Well, hello, everyone. Good to see many faces and friends. 2 mayors here we have with us. And Nick Welsh, the very definition of fake news, I see is joining. First of all, I want to, Lisa's presentation was just superb, and I'm sort of tempted to just sit down because it was really comprehensive and insightful. And as you'll see, mine is not dissimilar from hers. Can somebody help me figure out where mine is? Terrific. Among the things I was glad to hear Lisa say was bringing up the Procopius of Caesarion smearing Emperor Justinian in 500 BC, because I actually covered that story. That really the beginning of my political career. So I'm gonna talk pretty quickly just about the problem of fake news and what we can do about it. And I started with this quote from Timothy Snyder, who is a Yale law professor, because I think this really gets to the nut of what we're talking about. To abandon facts is to abandon freedom. If nothing is true, then no one can criticize power, because there is no basis on which to do so. If nothing is true, then all is spectacle. And I think that's kind of the political problem that we are facing today, not only in the United States, but really around the world, is having alternative facts, as the spokesperson for the president so aptly put it in the first week after he was inaugurated into office. So when we talk about fake news, I think what we're really talking about is how do we get back to having a common sense of what facts are. You know, basically nobody had heard of the term fake news 18 months ago. And now it seems like it drives every political conversation in every country. And no less a figure than Pope Francis has weighed in on it. This headline, Pope Warns on Fake News, is from the website Politico a couple of months ago. And his tracing of fake news he took in his homily back to the book of Genesis, pointing out that when the serpent lied to Eve about the apple and her ability to eat it, that was really the first instance of fake news that we were able to find in the Bible. So my hidden agenda here is basically the same as Lisa's. Oh, I see, 1, 1, and 2. That's pretty good. 1 and 1, yeah, okay. Anyway, I'm going to talk about what fake news is, how it's used, and spend some time on that from a political context, and then talk about some ideas for combating it. As many of you may know, fake news was actually the word of the year in 2017, awarded by the Collins English Dictionary, which they do every year for a new phrase. They gave it a very simple and clear definition: false, often sensational information disseminated under the guise of news reporting. And while that's a very workable basic definition, I think fake news has almost lost its meaning. It's so widespread, it's used in so many different ways as a political slur in attacks, in criminal actions brought by the government. And so I'm trying to break it down as a political observer. When I hear the term fake news, these are the 8 basic different ways that we look at it. First of all is the commercially driven, sensational, and made-up content, which began during the election of 2016, was launched by a group of teenagers in Veles, Macedonia. They set up 140 fake websites and began sending out stories that they wanted to go viral, not because they were interested in influencing the election, but because they would get more advertising hits on it and make money. So it was a purely commercial enterprise. They were the ones who said the Pope endorsed Donald Trump. They were the first ones to say that Hillary Clinton was running a child slavery ring out of a pizza place in Washington. And all of these stories went viral. In fact, BuzzFeed.com, a month after the election, found that of the 20 top read stories on Facebook in that month, 19 of them originated from this group of teenagers in Macedonia. So that was the original use of the word fake news in a political context. At the same time, as we now know, there is also state-sponsored fake news, and that the Russian government, under the direction of Mr. Putin, had set up a vast server farm, and they were in the business of setting up sites that made them appear to be American, but then was clearly attempting to influence the election by various forms, by organizing rallies, by sort of playing to people's biases, by reflecting what Lisa called bias confirmation. And 13 of those people, as you now know, have been indicted by Mr. Mueller, the special counsel who's looking into this. So that was really an unprecedented attack on our democracy by a foreign country. There's a fascinating book I'm almost done with. It's called Russian Roulette. It's by two veteran investigative reporters in Washington. And it really provides a very clear narrative of this whole Russian attack on the election. So much of it kind of comes out in bits and pieces and stories that it's hard to follow, but this is, it's all put together in one place. I highly recommend it. And one of the more interesting things is why the Obama administration did not do more about warning the country. And there were sort of half-hearted attempts, but there's a lot of politics behind that. But that also is a very important definition of fake news. Obviously, Facebook and social media generates and spreads a lot of it, and I think that's basically how we've gotten into this situation, is through the power of technology. Lisa mentioned the Daily Stormer, which was good because I was going to mention the Daily Stormer, so I'll just pass on that. But as you all know, it's very easy to get in your bubble on Facebook. And then the president, I think, deserves his own category of fake news through propaganda, lies, and information. And also, I think one of the things that's most cynical is his appropriation of the term fake news to turn on any reporting that he feels is unfair or critical of him. The Washington Post fact checker, which does a pretty good minute-by-minute attempt to keep up with him, as of March 3rd, I think, which was their last report to date of his administration, counted 2,536 lies or statement of misinformation that he has made in office so far. So it's happening two ways, is that he's putting out things that are untrue and then attacking as fake news things that are true, and in the process, devaluing the notion of truth itself, confusing people, throwing a lot of murk out there so that people begin to wonder what is factual and what is not. And that is not, incidentally, is a practice that authoritarian leaders have used for centuries. Fake news is also used to describe and attack partisan news sources, from Fox News to MSNBC. Certainly anyone on the left who hears anything on Fox would automatically discount it as fake news because it's on Fox. And similarly, I think anybody on the right would do the same for MSNBC, regardless, again, of the facts. They just assume an inherent bias, and therefore it is fake news. This is a fairly new development. Politicians setting up phony news sites that are designed to look like actual newspaper or broadcast websites. There's a woman running for the Senate in Arizona who set something up called the Arizona Monitor, which is a very good-looking site. I actually am going to steal some of her design ideas, but it's completely, it's just political propaganda in the guise of legitimate news operations. Devin Nunes, our representative from Fresno, who has been very active in supporting the president against the Russia investigation, also has one called the California Republican, which you can look up, and gives every appearance visually of being a authentic journalism website, but is in fact not. Lisa mentioned satire. Obviously, The Onion is fake news, although it seems more and more to be getting accurate to me. It's getting harder and harder for them to find stuff that's actually satire, because we're in a life and imitation of art phase, I think. And then, mainstream journalists make mistakes. They make errors. And sometimes stories do have the appearance of bias. And that, again, is a place where the term fake news is used primarily by politicians, members of the administration particularly. And so I would not try to tell you that the mainstream media does not play a part in this, and in fact, sometimes leave ourselves open to the charge of fake news. So knowing all that, we turn to Comrade Lenin's famous question, what is to be done? He's a good person to talk about fake news. Was the first one actually to call reporters the enemy of the people, which is a phrase that our president has also used to describe reporters when he's not describing them as, quote, scum, which is another favorite term. Here's, I think, what the underlying problem is. There's a 1985 book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And that was, you know, more than 30 years ago. This guy, Neil Postman, really, I think, found the problem. And that is we had sort of begun to move through television because of the predominance of television and how people were beginning to get their information from a fact-based view to a more emotion-based. He says, Orwell feared the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. But Postman's argued that the age of exposition, when people were informed by the printed word and its implicit requirement that arguments be rooted in logic and evidence, has been replaced by an age of show business. And that was more than 30 years ago he was talking about that. And if you look at the President of the United States, who describes the Oval Office as a studio, told reporters, welcome back to the studio, who has told his aides that every day in the White House is a different episode of a show, and their job is to present him as overcoming villains. And that's the plot that we want to pursue. And I think you can see how deep we are in the age of show business and how that fundamental withdrawal of logic, fact, and evidence in how people process information, in how all of us around the world process information, leaves us open to the effects of fake news. So it's a huge problem. And there's no magic bullet, to coin a cliche, but I think what we really have to think about is how do we chip away at it. The first thing you can do is subscribe to a good newspaper, or even two. The Lompoc Record, which does a pretty good job covering local news, had an editorial a couple weeks ago. They said, one thing is certain about the fake news phenomena. It is shining a spotlight on legitimate news agencies which work to get to the truth. For us newspaper folks, it's a matter of vetting, re-vetting, and vetting a third time. Checking facts for their validity has always been a basic procedure of print media, but that process has taken on greater significance since the era of fake news blossomed. And I think that is the attitude primarily throughout the news industry. You know, all we can do about this is continue to do our job. And if you look at what the New York Times and the Washington Post, and to a certain extent the Wall Street Journal, have done since the president became Donald Trump became president, it's quite remarkable. They've really had tremendously tough and accurate coverage. They've held him accountable. And as a result, I think, I know their subscriptions have risen, their online audiences have risen. So, you know, someone once called it the daily newspaper is the best verifiable version of the truth, and you get what you can get every day, and you keep going. And I think to the extent that citizens can support that effort, we'd all be better off. Legitimate fact-checking organizations, Lisa had them all listed there, factchecker.com, PolitiFact, Snopes. These are all available, and they do a really good job, and that's what they're in business about doing. So when you hear something that's too good to be true, it probably is, and it's worth looking there. Media literacy in schools. This is kind of becoming a thing of mine. I have a piece posted today at Newsmakers about a bill that Senator Hannah Beth Jackson, State Senator Jackson, has introduced, SB 947. And what it would do is take the first step. It would authorize, well, order the superintendent of schools to meet with a group of people to begin the process of designing curriculum that we can put into public schools to give students tools early on for doing this. I think it's a tremendous idea. You can go there. I did a little interview with her about it. But I think that's an idea that all of us need to get behind. You know, we don't teach citizenship anymore. You know, there aren't a lot of civics classes. And so people grow up, I was reading a recent poll, only 1 out of 4 people in the United States can name all 3 branches of the government. Only 1 out of 3 can name at least one of the rights in the First Amendment. I mean, it's astonishing the level of civic ignorance into which we've fallen, which makes all of us open to fake news. I think push for media transparency, that's, you know, I think that newspapers and serious television news operations have not done a very good job for years of explaining what it is we do and how we do it. Dean Baquet, the editor of the New York Times, was interviewed recently about this issue, and he said, "We spent our whole lives thinking that people assumed that we were honorable people. People assumed we were trying to find out what actually happened. I think we were wrong." And I think he's right, that the media has come to be viewed as just another political operation, another partisan operation. And so I think to the extent that we can explain things, and when you look at some of these stories that the Post and the Times do, you'll note, you know, they always say, you know, this story is based on interviews with, you know, 21 sources who are, you know, and identify where they are. The Post did a great story where they found out that this organization called Veritas, which goes around and tries to entrap journalists into saying various things, had planted someone to come to them to say that Roy Moore, who was the Republican candidate for Senate in Alabama, had abused her as a child. And they ran it down, and they found that it was not true. And then they did a whole story about how the story came about, which I think is very helpful to people. I think a lot of us in the media just assumed that when we said something, people would take it. So I think, you know, it's on us to do that. And then I think we all have to take personal responsibility. And those guidelines, some of them that Lisa mentioned, I think are excellent. They're out there. There's a lot of organizations, not a lot, but there's several organizations that do that. Annenberg has an operation for doing that with some good online videos. So that's kind of the overview. We can expand on any of these things in the question, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for enlightening us, entertaining us with a deep and serious issue. Thank you again. Our next presenter is Marga Cooley. The League of Women Voters Santa Maria had a fake news forum recently, and several of our league members went and heard her excellent presentation and were excited about the entire forum that they saw there. So we reached out, and she's here with us today. She has worked in the journalism field for 40 years in a variety of positions, including production, design, reporting, and editing. She graduated from Cal State Fresno, where she received the Paul V. Sheehan Award for Distinguished Service, and has worked at papers including the Fresno Bee, San Diego Union Tribune, and the Visalia Times Delta. Oh, I'm sorry, I want to interrupt and say thank you, Jerry, for giving us more confidence in our media. Thank you for that. And I'm sorry. Welcome.
Thank you, and I want to thank all of you for being here this afternoon to talk about what is such an incredibly important topic to all of us, and to thank the League of Women Voters for inviting me down from, I'm fine, thanks, for inviting me down here from North County to share with you this afternoon. What we've called fake news, which I think we've all touched on a little bit, has been around as a term since the 2016 election, but in a more complex way for certainly many more years than that. Like the radio and the introduction of television, what we have today is new technology, a new way of accessing fake news, and having fake news fed to us through social media that's able to micro-target American voters down to groups of 25 through face recognition and algorithms, with headlines that appeal to their individual predispositions to generate clicks and likes. What we also have is a society that doesn't take time to educate itself, a growing number of generations who read sound bites and feed off misinformation without taking the time that's required now more than ever to follow multiple sources, learn what news organizations and digital sites are credible and which are opinion-based or just entertainment. We also have a lack of investment in the importance of a free press in our society, and the degradation of newsrooms, most importantly at the local level, because local news is the lifeblood of democracy in many ways. It helps people understand what's going on in the world around them and is accountable to its readership. This spiral has created an information vacuum. I believe people want to learn things. If you don't have access to information that's vetted and solid, you'll absorb misinformation. You'll read what's there. I remember vividly when computers were introduced to our newsroom in 1984. I was covering city government at the time. And in the 30-plus years since that new technology was introduced, letters to the editor have been reduced to primarily comments on Facebook and social media. Everybody can suddenly become published and appear on equal footing. Social media altered the way people consume media and are alerted to the existence of news. Photographic evidence has been, which used to be seen as an impeccable standard, and that's no longer true. The internet has destroyed a lot of the business models that were supporting media through advertising as well. So how do you stop the flood? I don't think that it's possible. I mean, every time there's new technology, the advent of radio, the advent of television, social media wasn't even in the social lexicon of the world 10 years ago. What we have to remember is that we're dealing with new technology and people are still learning. They're learning how to distinguish between what's real and what's not, and things that seem extremely hopeless, and they do sometimes. This isn't unprecedented. It's been solved, and we'll solve it again. I see fake news as multifaceted. When Donald Trump talks about fake news, he's usually talking about what he perceives as biased news. Since the start of 2016, a survey by Network Research showed 1/3 of respondents have started to lose trust in the reliability of information presented by media outlets. The loss of trust is highest amongst millennials at a 38% reduction. Exposure to fake news is a key driver in the loss of trust. Almost half of those that think they've been exposed to fake news claim a reduction in trust, compared to only a fifth who do not think they've been exposed to fake news. The Fairness Doctrine was a regulation at the beginning of the television era in the 1940s, stating that both sides needed to be presented. We had rules. In the late 1980s, it was eliminated by the FCC. The loss is pointed to by some as a contributing factor in the rising level of party polarization. In about 2 years, political talk shows started. They showed up, and you don't have to give both sides on television or radio. A whole ecosystem developed. You're not hearing both sides of the issue anymore. So then the internet comes in, and you have an audience primed to not hear both sides. You also have the fact that the journalism model for mainstream media is collapsing because of the internet. Opinion is cheaper than real journalism. Journalism is expensive stuff. You work on organizations is not paid for or paid at a very low level. That's what most people are clicking on because we're primed to look at what we want to believe, and that's just not exact news. This has been going on since the beginning of time. It just keeps getting worse and worse as the finances of the industry collapse and social media kicks in. People are suddenly going to the front page of nothing. They're seeing it on Facebook, and the algorithms are giving them what they want. That's a problem that hasn't really been addressed at this point, although Mark Zuckerberg swears that he's going to take care of it. But is technology really the culprit? The internet has obviously supported its opportunities to spread information that's not accurate, but it's also enabled people to gauge and judge and learn. The web has its good points and its bad points. We need more sites like, as we've all talked about, Snopes.com. Scientists and skeptics are needed to become part of the response, to find accuracy and to let people know. Subscribe to some legitimate journalism and turn off ad blockers for specific sites you like. Check before you retweet something or share something. Read it all the way through. Make sure it's credible. Go to Google and double check. There's a lot of discussion and activity to combat fake news. There are funds, apps, conferences, websites like misinfocon.com, but you can't just waste your energy running around correcting people. What truly needs to happen is that journalism needs to be prioritized, both financially and in society. We need to drown the misinformation, the sustained propaganda effort. People are ruled by emotion. Did you even read the article? Did you just start typing away to comment? Many comments are a telltale sign that people aren't educating themselves. Reading is one way to avoid fake news. So who can you trust? As an editor of a local newspaper group, my hope is that your answer will be the Santa Maria Times or other local news media. We take our role very seriously in providing information so that our readers know what's going on in their community and can make educated decisions about their local government. That's not to say that we don't make an occasional error, but if we catch it or if it's brought to our attention, we correct it. If you have a concern, call us, send us an email. We're accountable. The most important point I can make is use your head. If you have any doubt, if something seems sensational, do some research. Visit credible news sources. Don't be part of the problem and just share information without knowing what you're sharing is true. Pay attention to the domain and the URL. Established news organizations usually own their domains and have a standard look. Sites ending in .com, .co should tip you off. For example, abcnews.com is a legitimate news source, but abcnews.com, .co is not, even though it has a similar appearance. Read the About Us section. Know who it is that you're looking at. Check the comments. Do a reverse image search. A picture should be accurate in illustrating what the story is about. This often doesn't happen. Reverse search an image on Google by right-clicking on the image and choosing the search Google for it. If the image is appearing on a lot of stories about many different topics, there's a good chance it's not actually an image of what it says it was on the first story. Ultimately, never stop looking. Learning the truth is a process, not a goal. As a journalist, I can never express everything in a single day. The saving grace is tomorrow when we try to do a little bit more. And it's the same for me as a news consumer. I'll always be learning more. Channeling Brooke Binkowski with Snopes, one thing you can do, besides not being credulous and passing along incendiary information, is to be kind to people who have different opinions, because the end goal of disinformation is to turn people against each other, to shatter a national identity, and to make people pliable and vulnerable as a nation. When you have no sense of unity, it makes it extremely easy to weaken a country. And in a weak country, the people suffer and the country becomes weaker. It happens all the time. And this is the end result of disinformation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
In this 20 years of research that I've done, I have to admit that it has been sometimes a little bit of an uphill battle, because there's been a sense out there that, well, people know, or they should know, what's reasonable and what's not when when they are looking at information they find online. And so if they get duped, it's their fault, right? Those dummies out there, they should know better. So I kind of think of this as, this sort of caveat emptor type of argument, the buyer beware, but in this case, I guess it would be browser beware, right? So the attention on fake news has made my life actually a little bit easier in some ways, because people can really now grasp how evaluating the credibility of information is an important issue with very far-reaching consequences for our democracy. So that's sort of nice, I guess, in a very perverse and certainly self-serving way. All right, but another bit of good news about fake news is that because the issue has been raised and the limelight has been shown on this at a sort of a national level, there are now more resources being devoted to studying and to solving the problem of fake news. For example, I think that this whole, since this story really kind of broke about fake news, there has been a renewed call for digital citizenship and for information literacy, both within our schools as well as in the larger public, and I think that's a good thing. Also, new funding initiatives from foundations, places like the Knight Foundation, and also even from the federal government through places like the National Science Foundation, have focused some of the best academic minds on the problem of fake news and how to go about solving this problem from multiple perspectives. And so normally, if you're not familiar with how the academy works, oftentimes, too often really, we all get sort of stuck in our own little departmental boxes, and we talk to our colleagues in our own departments who share perspectives, but rarely is it the case that we get to really talk to people from outside of our disciplines to see how they're thinking about a problem and what solutions and what methods they have to attack a problem. And so what I think the attention to fake news has brought is, it has brought together psychologists, together with computer scientists, together with communication scholars, journalism researchers, historians, political scientists, and public policy, people who study public policy, in a way into a conversation that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And I think, having these joint efforts to combat such a complex problem as fake news is always a good thing. I think that also the controversy around fake news has energized advocacy groups as well, and made all the efforts of all of these groups and all these people I'm talking about to increase information literacy more prominent, and I think they've gotten really creative. I think it's prompted new ways of thinking about these questions that we've been studying for a long time that are more accessible to the public, in some cases even fun. So for example, I've seen instances where teams are trying to develop games to help people discern, what to believe, what is fake news and what is, real news. Sort of spot the fake kind of games that I think are interesting to think about, and especially as we think about training kids to be critical information consumers. I think these efforts are creative and interesting and offer some promise. I've also seen some interesting efforts in where social scientists work together with computer scientists to develop sort of in-the-moment prompts to help people, to get people to critically evaluate the information that they're reading while online. So while you're actually scanning something, there might be a prompt to say, like, here's the source for this information, and here's what we know about it, or you might want to think about this information in a new way. And I think those are some promising avenues as well. And I certainly have seen that the attention to fake news has resulted in better and more sophisticated algorithms for automatically detecting fake news and bringing it to people's attention. In fact, I'm really heartened to see that there has been reaching out by social scientists and computer scientists to each other to say we need to put our heads together to think about how to make sophisticated algorithms that go beyond just, this source is among a list that has been, that people think are credible sources like the New York Times, to think about, okay, we need to do that, but we also need to understand something about how humans, think about these issues, their cognitive heuristics and biases that they bring with them, and to incorporate those into the algorithms as well. So I think that the work there is also promising. And together, I think that these things have generally increased public awareness of the tools and certain services that are available for helping people to know, whether to believe something or not. So groups like factcheck.org and PolitiFact and things like this, the fact-checking organizations, I think are getting the attention that they're due, finally. Just one example of that is one of the sources that I go to for news is Google News, and it's interesting that now on the right-hand side there is a list of kind of fact-check stories from those fact-checking organizations that I don't know would have been there before our national conversation about fake news started. And probably most amazing to me personally is that the focus of fake news has done something that I did not think was ever going to be possible, and that is it has propelled the social media platforms themselves, so platforms like Facebook, for example, to consider opening access to their data trove to academics and researchers who can help them to better understand the nature of the problem of fake news and how, therefore, to combat the problems that it creates. And this is true even despite the recent Cambridge Analytica scandal. Facebook has now made some moves to the academic community to say, hey, maybe we need you. Which they've never done before. They've been very closed door with us when we say, hey, maybe we could help you try to figure out what all this data means if if we had access to it. Nope. So that's very heartening to me. But I think in all of this, the question remains whether any of these good things that I've been talking about can overcome the very strong tendency for people to believe what they want to believe. No matter what kind of evidence or rationalization is put before them. We know this because research in social science shows that it's very, very difficult to break these kinds of tendencies. So for example, I don't know if it was talked about earlier, but confirmation biases run very strong in human reasoning. That is that people tend to believe information that is consistent with their own political stance or with their worldview. And it's very difficult to, people immediately kind of buy into that information and don't question it as much, and that's hard to kind of break that habit. We also know from research that even if inaccurate information is corrected, it is often still believed. You sort of can't, if you've heard something, you kind of can't unring the bell, right? That information still kind of percolates for you. And research finds it still does have effects on people's belief of it, even if it's incorrect and later corrected. We also know that making those corrections are very, very difficult. Most of them are ineffective, and it's very tricky to correct information that people have already heard before in a way that is effective and actually makes their beliefs more accurate. And we also know that social media can serve as echo chambers for misinformation. This is particularly problematic, I think, for fake news because fake news is packaged in a way that's meant to grab attention and to promote its own virality by being interesting, shocking, and is often passed from trusted friend to trusted friend. And so combating this can be very difficult. In fact, fake news is really a perfect recipe. You have, it garners attention. If people, agree with the political stance that it purports, it's really hard to make them feel any differently about it. If they've heard it through multiple sources, maybe being passed around through the echo chamber of social media, it becomes familiar, and the repetition process itself makes it more believable. And so all of these things together, attention, agreement, familiarity, repetition, and especially receipt from someone who you know is in your, a Facebook friend, someone you know, this is a recipe for belief of such information. And so this is a tough problem for all of us to face. I think that there's a little bit of good news. Overall, I'm quite worried about it myself, but hopefully I've given you a little bit of good news to glom onto today. Thank you.
Who would believe there's good news regarding fake news? But it was all encouraging information. We have a lot of questions that were written, and if we still have time, we'll take verbal questions. We have roving mics, but we're going to go from the written questions to begin with. How do legitimate professional journalists under deadline pressures separate fake news from real news? Explain the role of editors. And there's two questions. What would the panelists advocate as a way to spread critical thinking and media literacy? two different questions. Anyone like to start?
I can start with the first one, and then maybe Jerry would be good for the second one. Under deadline pressure, there are lots of different types of news stories, and I think it's really critical from a news literacy standpoint to understand the different types of reporting that go into those stories. You have breaking news stories, which are, happening immediately. You have to be out there. You have to be getting information from sources such as law enforcement, such as first responders, that are on the scene, and you're using that information as well as your own visual identification of what's going on to cover that story and make sure that it's accurate. In an enterprise story, which is a story that is a look at an issue over a broader stretch of time, you're doing a lot of factual research, you're identifying an issue or a problem, and you are putting resources into finding those facts and building an explanation for why that issue is what it is with different perspectives to support that. So from that standpoint, it's a little bit different than a deadline story because you are taking more time to do that factual research. So repeat the question just real quick.
The second question?
The first one.
The first one. How do legitimate professional journalists under deadline pressures separate fake news from real news? Explain the role of an editor.
Okay, so fake news would be something that would be created for profit or to generate a specific agenda, to perpetuate a specific agenda. And the different types of reporting that we do from a local media standpoint as newspapers and other media resources are done on a fact-based basis. And so from an editing standpoint, we look at those, we check the facts, we talk to our reporters, and we rely on the sources that we have. Fake news would be a separate avenue.
Are there any response to this question?
Yeah, I would just, a couple things. I mean, I think it's hard to remember now almost, but when I got into the business in the 70s, there was, and really up until 2000 and some of the economic problems, there are so many multiple levels of editing that if you were a city-side reporter, you would talk to your assignment editor on the city desk before you went out, kind of what you were looking for. You'd come back, you'd talk to that person. They would read the story, edit the story, and put it over to the news desk, where a news editor, who is going to decide whether it goes in the paper and if so where, is going to read it and take a critical eye. Then it's going to go to the copy desk, where the head of the copy desk, the dealer, looks at it quickly, gives it to a copy editor who writes a headline, also has questions, and then gets a second read, then goes out, someone proofreads it. So there were a lot of levels of protection built into that, all sort of aimed at the key question, which is, how do I know this is true? Or what did I not report that would make this a fuller picture, or that might even undercut it? Since newspapers have been under such tremendous financial pressure, a lot of that has gone away. Two things happened. One is when the internet began, and I can remember, this happening, where you would have a reporter do a very thorough and fact-checked story for the paper, but you wanted something quick, and so they posted something. So all of a sudden we had two sets of standards, two differing sets of standards. And today, when there's so much pressure on reporters to tweet and put things on social media and get an Instagram picture, it's really that the urgent has kind of taken the place of the important to a large extent. So there's been a lot of financial pressure, I think, that's driven that, and also, using the technology. What was the second question?
Before we go to that, a couple of weeks ago, this library had an educational session on fake news, and they showed a TED Talk. And in the TED Talk, it was stated that there are no editors for social media. And you could see how important that has been for the printed media to have editors. So that's a very good point. The second part was, what would you panelists advocate as a way to spread critical thinking and media literacy?
I want to hear Miriam.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, I would say that that is something that school librarians and media specialists are already doing. It's actively their job, and one of the best things that we can do is advocate for those professionals to be in our schools and make sure that they have funding, because that's what they're there for.
I'll just add to that. One part of the problem is that before this issue sort of became a national issue, it's not that it wasn't important. There were lots of educational efforts, and these have been ongoing for some time. But I think that it might be time to try to think about this from a national level, because one of the challenges for media literacy efforts, even in the school system, where you'd think that would be one of the easier places to, okay, you have this audience, you know, can present this curriculum to them, is that we don't really have a national curriculum for this. And so these kinds of programs are done at a local level, district by district. This is different than a lot of other countries. Countries like Australia, Canada have a national curriculum that is, you know, standard for, you know, across the public education system to put this in. And so because of that, again, I think that there's some opportunities while working at that national level for teachers to, you know, share more, get best practices, and distribute that out broadly. So yes, these efforts are happening. I would just like to see them happen in a more coordinated, broader way.
Any other comments to that? Okay, thank you. Good newspapers continue to struggle financially and cut staff to the bone, or they are purchased by moguls like Rupert Murdoch. How does this affect good news and accurate news? Expository news, availability of accurate news. What can be done to counter this?
I think one of the things that can be done to counter that is to have an investment by our society in journalism, both from a readership standpoint and from an advertising standpoint, because we have to have both to be successful and to be able to do the kind of reporting that supports our democracy and keeps transparency alive. So that would be my first suggestion. I think also to communicate with your news media and find out how they work and learn how to make them work for you. Find the stories that are enterprise stories and give them feedback. Let them know that those are important to you, so that they know that that's something that they are investing worthwhile time in. There has been, I think, some change in the way we do things from an internet, with the arrival of the internet, and there is certainly, to expand a little bit, an effort to get things up more quickly, but I think it also allows us to go back to those stories and really add on to them and develop them. For instance, if we have a breaking news situation that we want to get up immediately, we might get 6 inches up on what's happening, but we go through that story throughout the day and update that, so that at the end of the day, you'll have as complete a story as possible. And then if you have a print edition as well, that goes into the print edition the next day. So it isn't just slapping something up, in a minute or two and leaving it. Usually those stories are something that we continue to work on and flesh out.
I think the fundamental issue is an economic one, which is that the business model of newspapers got broken, because what newspapers were selling was a mass audience to advertisers who would buy space in the paper so they could get those eyeballs. Well, the problem was that as a general interest publication, there was all kinds of different eyeballs. So now people can go online, and Google and Facebook, control 75, 80% globally of online advertising. So if you're a local news organization and you're trying to make it on online advertising, which is incremental compared to what print used to be, it's a very, very difficult model. So what you've seen is, for example, the New York Times, which has been successful with its online transition, is really a subscription-based model, that people are buying the content because it's quality content. And even at that, they're still not, making tons of money, and the print paper, particularly the Sunday paper, remains a huge percentage of their revenue. You have the nonprofit model. If you look down in San Diego, I think it's called the San Diego Reader or whatever, where they've gotten some initial donations and people contribute to it and keep it going. And then you kind of have the rich person model, which has been so successful in our city. But this rich guy whose day job is curing cancer just bought the Los Angeles Times, and a lot of people are looking at that to see how it works. But the problem is, for online news, which is where the world is going, what is the business model? How are you going to generate enough money to pay for reporting, which is expensive? It's expensive to pay for someone to go out and look at something, particularly when they may do it for 2 weeks and come back and say, you know what, the story's not there, which is the right thing to do. But it's not something that's a lot of people want to make a long-term investment in. So it's finding a business model that works, and I think that's the $24 billion question that everybody's struggling with.
The next question is, there is a course at Santa Barbara City College, Information Literacy Library 101, that teaches techniques for verifying reliable sources of information. Would you recommend a course like this to the community, and are there other ways to educate the community who are concerned with misinformation?
Sure, yeah, I can take this one. Those are an excellent idea. Our library also, as you said, had a very similar free course that you could attend, and it's our mission to make sure that information literacy is spread throughout as far as we can go. So the best way is to honestly just continually be looking for new ways to inform yourself about where you can learn these sorts of literacies, and the library is a great place to go, whether that's here, City College, universities always have excellent programs like that.
Because I was the bearer of good news earlier, I'll be a little bit of a bearer of bad news now. Only just to mention that one of the studies that I've done pertaining to this topic, we found what we called optimistic bias in people's perceptions of their own ability to properly evaluate information. So when we asked people, how likely is it that you might be the victim of some misinformation online? People would say, oh, not me. I'm fine. I don't know about you. I'm okay, but, And so I think that, the other part of the battle is getting people to understand the value of these programs and getting people to participate in these programs. Because if we all think that we're, better than average, the Lake Woebegone effect, right? We're all better than average information evaluators, then we probably won't take advantage of those programs.
To verify what she's saying, at the workshop that the library put on, there were only 2 of us attending. What a shame. What a shame. Because they had available 6 flyers, different flyers with information like the one we're handing out today. So, okay.
Well, at least you got a lot of flyers.
Right. I got well informed, and I'm sharing it today. So.
But you already knew it, right?
No, I didn't. I'm always learning. And I noticed you guys were taking notes. All of you up there were taking notes from the other speakers, and that was really exciting. How much does media consolidation, mergers, the failure to enforce the Sherman Antitrust Act have to do with fake news? So someone may inform us what the Sherman Antitrust Act is before you answer the question.
Yeah, why don't you, I can be specific.
Be specific.
Why don't you generalize first? No, I was just going to talk about Sinclair Broadcasting, which many of you have probably read about in recent days, which has consolidated a lot of TV stations around the country and has been dictating content to local stations that for attacking CNN, for example, as fake news, or reading particularly editorials on the air that all endorse Donald Trump. So I think it's a problem, but I think there's also I don't know, is Gannett still around? Or I mean, there are good newspaper companies that are still around, and there would be local newspapers that were not alive were it not for their corporate support. So, you know, I think again, it's a thing where you kind of have to look at the specific case that you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't particularly think that the conglomeration of ownerships has changed at a great level the local news aspects of what we do. I think that we work, you know, their bread and butter is to maintain that local news content and that autonomy in that market. So at that level, I think we have continue to be successful.
You know, and there's an exciting story, actually, I should mention, in Colorado now, where the Denver Post, which used to be a very great, robust paper, regional paper, has been purchased by a financial services company, by a hedge fund, basically. And they've just been cutting and cutting and cutting, and they just had another layoff of about 30 people in the newsroom, and the editorial page editor took it upon himself, without informing anyone on Sunday, to produce an entire section attacking the ownership of the paper and calling on citizens in the community to join to buy the paper, to find some way to keep the paper going, and pointing out what the public service was that it provided. So there's a lot of interest in that in the news industry, and there has been some response, but that's the kind of thing that we've been reduced to.
Well, we have 4 cards here that are basically the same, so I'm going to try to merge them. And people are asking for a review of trusted sites for verification of facts, such as Politico. If you could name a few more. Unbiased papers. What are the most unbiased papers? I know some of these have been covered, but if you could review a few more. We've had 4 questions regarding that.
I just have my list that I already presented. I don't have a further one. Let me pull out my list.
I mean, I read a lot of sites. I think I have, I don't know, probably 20 or 25 bookmarked news sites, and I look at all of them, you know, throughout the day from time to time, once, twice, more. And they are, I mean, they are of an ideological range of things. I mean, I read the Weekly Standard, I read National Review, I read Breitbart, I look at Drudge, but, you know, on the other side. So, you know, I have a lot of obvious time to waste online. So not everybody, I think, you know, can convince themselves that that's part of, you know, what they should be doing. But, you know, I think grazing across lines is a good way to do that.
Yeah, and I would just repeat that it's just in the same vein that it's important to escape those filter bubbles that we were talking about earlier by doing just that. And I can relist those sources that I spoke about, which were Snopes.com, PolitiFacts.com, and FactCheck.org. And those are all really great places to go if you suspect that something might be untrue.
MissInfocon.com is also a good site.
What level of impact do you believe comes from religious institutions?
Impact on what?
That's all there
On
is on
fake
this
news?
question. I guess, is it? That's all there is. On opinions.
Huge. I would say huge, the impact would be. I wanted to ask Miriam, when you talk about a set of national standards for media literacy, I'm curious. For example, I don't know, say Mississippi or something, the standard might be you know, they're teaching evolution. It's fake news, you know, versus creation. I just, and that's what occurred to me when you said that, was the sort of the influence of religious groups and evangelical groups on local school boards and so on and so forth. How do you get there?
Yeah, that's well, I mean, that's sort of part of my argument, that by leaving it at the local level, to have local jurisdictions have complete control over whether they will have such media literacy efforts or not, and the shape that they take, I think might exacerbate these kinds of problems. Whereas if you had kind of a national curriculum that we all could agree on, people from different regions, different perspectives, different religious backgrounds, different social backgrounds, that maybe that could help stem the problem a little bit.
I might ask if any of the other panelists have questions for any of the other panelists at this point. Okay, is there anyone from the audience that has a question?
Yes, I was just looking for some suggestions for what one might read every day. I subscribe to the LA Times and read it every day faithfully, and I look at CNN. Can you suggest some other sources that are readily available and one can read, not simply look up on the internet?
You know, if you're interested in political news, there's a site called Real Clear Politics, which is an aggregation site, but it collects more analysis and commentary, but some breaking news as well, from a variety of perspectives. You know, so you know, you might find that they have two stories in a row that says, you know, Trump is an idiot about foreign policy, and the next one says, you know, Trump is much better than Obama on foreign policy. So it's kind of laid out there for you to kind of compare and contrast, and you know, if you kind of graze through that, you see a variety of opinions quite easily. You know, beyond that, I think the New York Times is a great newspaper. I subscribe to the New York Times. I read it a lot. I get a lot of their newsletters. You know, and obviously their opinion pages are very liberal, and I think that's, you know, an accurate description. But in terms of their news coverage, I just don't think that there's anything that compares. Real Clear Politics, just like it sounds, realclearpolitics.com.
And I'll just jump in. I mentioned when I spoke that one of the sources I look at is Google News, and I'm not endorsing Google News or saying it's a fantastic place to go, but what it is a news aggregation site, so that it picks stories from a variety of different news sources. And so you can, it's exactly what Jerry was just saying, in terms of you can have stories that come from one side of the political divide next to stories that come from the other side, and so you can sort of pick and choose, and at least be exposed to headlines from a different perspective. Sometimes that's actually very interesting to see how they're sort of framing just in the headline alone the difference of, you know, Trump on foreign policy or something like that.
May I introduce myself? This is enriching to me. I was the newscaster for the Australian Broadcasting Commission for a 4-year contract for Southeast Asia. So when you talk about this, it reminds me of my job, what to do. We have Reuters and Associated Press. That was the news that came to us. We also are connected with Voice of America. And this interests me because we were under pressure. I was the only woman in my state, Philippines and Indonesia, to represent the news. And we received the news from Associated Press and Reuters. Also, we are connected with Voice of America. We have to be very, very careful. I understand what happened is that the news in the Australian Broadcasting Commission was more controlled. It's controlling. However, we do have news outside us. And what happened is that when I came to Indonesia and Malaysia, just to find out what happened to the news that we broadcast, I have 9 million audience.
Thank you for your information. This is the time for questions for our panelists. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So it seems like as quickly as we try to identify sources of fake news, Jerry, your list was fantastic. I think technology is going to show us some new ones. So online the other day, I saw a video. It was produced by the highly acclaimed film director, Jordan Peele, who just made the movie Get Out, that I was too afraid to go watch. Still have to see that someday. He took Obama and took a speech, and there's some applications now that you can basically take all the words that he said and then write a script that you want him to say, and then he said it. So it starts out and you see Obama and he's saying these pretty crazy, outrageous things about Trump and such, including saying, I would never say these things, and then the screen splits and you see Jordan Peele actually doing Obama's voice. You can kind of tell because it's not exactly Obama's voice. But the point is that there's an application now, and I guess film people use this to maybe make some corrections when they're making film, when the voice and the words don't match up exactly. So this is going to be a whole new thing where we see videos with public officials who seem to be saying something, and maybe it's kind of not what they normally would say. And then we're going to have to go through this whole argument and vetting about, well, did he really say that?
Joey, do you have a question?
So the question is, what do you think about that?
I'm pretty sure we're doomed. I don't. No, it's true. I mean, you know, and just, you know, reading a lot of stuff in preparation for this, one of the headlines that kept popping out was, you think it's bad now, it's going to get worse because of the use of artificial intelligence is going to enable things like precisely what you just said. And so sorting things out is not going to get any easier.
Yeah, this is something that the academic community is both creating and turning its attention to with the advances in AI, machine learning, and all these things. The ability to create, as you say, take someone's voice and video and sort of recreate in a way that's really difficult to detect is a huge problem, and it is right on our horizon, and we will need to figure out mechanisms to detect, you know, technological tinkering, if you will, and other means to deal with this. In fact, I was just talking to a colleague of mine who's a computer scientist who wants to work on this problem, so hopefully I'll try to work on it too soon.
I think that also applies to images as well. Just the drastic ability to just manipulate and completely reconstitute images to have them show whatever you want them to show and have it not be accurate at all is a huge problem that we'll have to address.
Next question.
Hi. I actually wanted to take a second because I feel that through no ill intent, that there was actually a little bit of misinformation that was presented today. And that is an understanding of what social media news sources like Facebook and Google News, and Miriam, I know that you touched on that, and you when you mentioned that Google News is an aggregate of other news sources. It was stated earlier that that our editors needed for social media, or editors are needed for social media. No, definitely not. Facebook and Google do not produce news. They're not content providers. Think of them as the newsstand on the corner. So instead of having to get out of them in the morning and go out of bed and go to the newsstand on the corner and get my newspaper, I can go to my news feed. It's up to me what I put in that feed. So if I fill it with things like, you know, just really biased things that have been forwarded to me from my friends and take no proactive initiative to go out and subscribe to news sources, things like Wall Street Journal, or like pages through Reuters or Associated Press, or go to government reporting agencies and like their pages, you would be shocked how much wonderful raw data you can get sent directly to you in your Facebook feed by going and liking certain government reporting agencies. So I just want to say, Facebook and Google News and things like that are a very double-edged sword. But I think the ability or the potential for great, good things far outweighs that for bad. And that being that all these people who've taken the time to show up here today, we can respond, we can question things when they're sent to us, like, yeah, what's your source? You know, we have a responsibility to do that. So, but the double-edged sword being that there is bad. There are going to be people who try to manipulate it and people who try to scare us away from using it, because if we stop using it, then we stop sharing ideas. And let's face it, the more we share ideas, the greater we can become as a people.
Thank you for your comments.
My question is to all of you on the panel, and maybe the lady that just finished speaking too. What do you think of the pros and cons would be for having a labeling system just to let people know this image, this text, whatever, has been altered, and maybe why or how?
Well, I mean, I think that's something that mainstream media always did. I mean, there's ethical codes that say you can't do that, or if you're going to do that, then you identify it as something that you have altered, or a photo illustration that you've done, and so on. I don't know how you would do that online. You know, on my website, I basically just find things from here and there on Google Images, but whenever I write about the Russia issue, there's an image of Putin and Trump riding together bareback on a horse, which is so perfect that I run it a lot. And I guess it's been enhanced or changed or created or something. But the context in which I'm presenting it, I think is clearly a satiric one. So I'm not sure who would do the labeling or who would be in charge of regulating the labeling, but I just think that's a very difficult problem online in the Wild West part of the web.
I'll just also add that does make sense for certain types of fake news, but I don't know if you covered it earlier when I was still teaching my class, but there's kind of there's debate over what fake news is and what should be included in that category and excluded in that category. So there could be things that are altered in some way, or there could be information that was created for profit or some other reason that's completely not based on fact at all. But there's also a large nebulous category of, you know, information about real events that that the portrayal of those events is so biased. So sort of how do you detect and label that can get very subjective. So I think that the labeling idea does work in some cases, in some other cases. In fact, Facebook did have, they did put a warning, you know, contested story, things like this, and they abandoned it pretty quickly, I think, because of these problems that it's very difficult to label things. It's, you know, very controversial. Some people would say something is you know, true, and other people would say no, it's false or it's biased or this sort of thing. So it's a tricky issue.
I think you need to treat it the same way you would treat identifying fake news versus a manipulated image. You have to question it and, you know, go to a legitimate source and make sure that you're doing your research. You know, do a Google search and see if it's been used. See, you know, but question, think critically, because labeling, as I think we've all said, is not going to work across the board from an internet standpoint.
Thank you for your questions. I want to remind you that we have 2 candidate forums, May 1 and May 4. Watch the candidate forums and then vote. Thank you.